Hello, I'm Galip Dalai, Research Director at Al-Sharq Forum. Today in Washington, D.C., we have Rachel Havrelock. She is Associate Professor at Illinois University in Chicago. Rachel, it's a pleasure having you.
Thank you.
We just have had this event in partnership with Foreign Affairs in which we try to look at the Sykes-Picot at its centenary, and you're one of the panelists. One thing that distinguished you from the other panelists was that the premises of your analysis of Sykes-Picot was quite unique, in which basically you have a resource-based approach towards Sykes-Picot. In your judgment first, what was Sykes-Picot all about?
Okay, so there's a quotation that's often cited that Sir Marx made, where he said, "I would like to draw a line from the first K in Kirkuk to the last E in Accra." And usually analysts take this to be a sign that the Sykes-Picot line was completely arbitrary, that Sykes didn't really know why he was drawing it, Georges Picot went along with it. When Sir Mark Sykes made that statement in the British Parliament, he was corrected to say, oh, Sir Mark Sykes really means that the line will end at Haifa. So this was really mysterious to me. Why was this line drawn? And as I was looking into it, I realized that that dividing line between the French area of control and the British area of control was a dividing line primarily between two planned oil pipelines, because the British and the French were allied in World War I in trying to defeat the Germans and the Ottomans, but they didn't know how long they'd be allies. And much of their military work in the region was in the name of not only claiming oil wells in the Mosul and Kirkuk region, but also planning pipelines to ports in the Mediterranean. And so the Sykes-Picot line, more than anything else, divided between the zone of a French pipeline and the zone of a British pipeline. And those pipelines were built in 1934 and 1935.
So your phrase was quite catchy when you said it's not a new line in the sand, but it's a pipeline in the sand. So from this perspective, you are basically essentially seeing Sykes-Picot as a resource sharing arrangement, right?
That's absolutely right. There was an agreement that preceded the war that was called the Turkish Petroleum Company. There was nothing Turkish about it. The Turkish Petroleum Company was a British company. And in the Turkish Petroleum Company, it was essentially a resource sharing agreement among the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the Shell Oil Company, and Deutsche Bank. Mm-hmm. And so when France and Britain went to war against Germany, that freed up their share. And so that share went to the French. They then formed the Compagnie Française de Pétrole, which later became Total. And then following the war, after the Americans got involved, another percentage was taken from the British and given to an American company that was basically Standard Oil. So the Sykes-Picot sort of stands in between these two oil agreements, the Turkish Petroleum and the Iraq Petroleum. But we have to be careful because there's nothing Turkish about the TPC and nothing Iraqi about the IPC. And so Sykes-Picot was this key moment when the British and French said, you know, we'll divide our zones of influence based on having separate oil corridors. So it was about sharing the oil, and it was about dividing the way the oil would leave the region.
Once you frame it that way, I mean, in your recent article at Foreign Affairs magazine, you said, I'm trying to paraphrase it, one of the best way for the Middle East to reach post-Sykes-Picot Middle East system is to create sovereignty over resources and local ownership of these resources. What do you mean by that? Like, could you please opine?
Yeah, absolutely right. You are the ideal reader of the article. But I think when we think about 100 years of Sykes-Picot as we're doing today, it's 100 years of extraction of the things of value out of the region and the profit made by companies that weren't in the region. So it meant that the way in which sovereignty and political power formed in the region, it formed on the basis of the local people's alienation from the very source of their wealth. And it had tremendous political repercussions because the companies were always thinking about how to keep people from unifying to demand either total control over the resources, partial control over the resources, or some share in the contracts. And so in order to thwart labor movements, nationalist movements, regional movements, the companies and the colonial powers put tremendous pressure on ethnic differences. They employed different ethnicities at different sorts of jobs, and in numerous ways they really stoked competition. So I think if we're talking about a kind of a post-Sykes-Picot reality, my point is not necessarily that borders need to be drawn, but rather we have to transform that structure of sovereignty and turn that alienation from the resources to local stakes and shares in the resources and in the wealth that is generated from them. It's very important that that be on the basis of region and locality and not ethnicity. Right? These were never ethnically cohesive nation states, and they're not today. So the principle in which people can live together and work towards a common future is having that common share and ownership in their resources. And I think that we do have a very interesting example in Iraqi Kurdistan, where following 2007, Kurdish representatives had some share in those oil contracts, and they've used that revenue in order to form a pretty strong opposition against ISIS in the form of the Peshmerga. There's a big debate right now between the Iraqi central government and the KRG about new oil contracts. I do think that the KRG should have majority stakes in those, but I think it should not be on the basis of Kurdish ethnicity, but it should be on the basis of northern Iraq, representing all the people there, and that kind of wealth can generate social stability, refugee absorption, social programs, and also a defensive military to protect that land.
Well, the formula seems to be quite clear in your mind.
Yeah.
For the Middle East to reach a post-Sykes-Picot Middle East system.
Yes.
Sovereignty over the resources, not territory, and local ownership of them. The question and the challenge is that how are we going to get there first?
Okay, it's a great question and something I'm working on all the time. So I'll start from specific examples and then try to work to something more of a model. But it is very clear again in the case of the Peshmerga, we've never seen an oil company raise an army. Right, so when those shares are threatened, the oil company doesn't defend them. But we did see in the case of the Peshmerga, places where there is that local ownership, they're ready to raise an army to have incredible risk and sacrifice. Now, of course, it's much harder in Syria, but I think for the opposition groups against ISIS, right, to come with the existing gas and oil contracts to say, look, there's revenue that is generated or can be generated, right? This is yours, right? Some percentage goes to the military, some percentage goes to rebuilding. So in that case, in places that are destabilized, like regions of Iraq and Syria, it's the exact right moment to renegotiate these contracts now. Not to wait till everything's better, but to create that revenue for the people on the ground. I think also in cases of long-standing conflict, such as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? Everyone goes on and on about peace treaty, what to do, but there's something that can be done very immediately, which is to confer water sovereignty on the Palestinians. the water situation in Gaza is an absolute nightmare, but that's not the case right now in the West Bank. Israel's in a position where it has more water than it needs through desalination. So I think on the case of water sovereignty, resource sovereignty, it's something that the international community could move on now. You don't have to wait to solve every problem in the book, but it's something that's necessary for life, for livelihood, for economic growth. And in the cases of the deepest conflict, sovereignty over resources is actually the thing that one could move on right now. You don't have to wait for it.
Rachel, it was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.